Hi, I'm Riza. My husband Marcus drained our savings account to fund his mistress's luxury lifestyle, spending over $60,000 on designer bags, spa weekends, and even a down payment for her new car. He thought he was clever, moving money while I was busy building my marketing consultancy. But what Marcus didn't know was that I had already moved our real fortune, the assets he didn't even realize existed, into accounts he'd never find. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but sometimes it's even sweeter when served with financial statements and a side of public humiliation. Let me show you how I turned his betrayal into his biggest mistake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through our kitchen blinds in Scottsdale, casting geometric shadows across the marble countertops I had picked out 3 years ago when we renovated. I was standing at the coffee machine, still in my silk pajamas, scrolling through my phone while waiting for my espresso to finish brewing. It was a Tuesday in March, one of those perfect Arizona mornings where the temperature hadn't yet climbed to unbearable heights, and the desert air still held a hint of coolness from the night before. I had built a routine around these quiet moments. Before the day exploded into client calls, strategy meetings, and the controlled chaos of running my own marketing firm. At 32, I had spent the last 8 years building Catalyst Creative from a spare bedroom operation into a 7-figure consultancy that handled campaigns for tech startups and established brands across the Southwest. The work was demanding, but it was mine, and every success felt earned through late nights, rejected pitches, and the kind of persistence that comes from knowing you're building something that matters. Marcus was already gone for his morning run, a habit he'd developed about 6 months ago, along with a sudden interest in protein shakes and expensive athletic wear. I didn't think much of it at first. We'd been married for 5 years, together for 7. And I figured everyone goes through phases where they want to get in better shape or try new things. He worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, traveling frequently throughout Arizona and New Mexico, building relationships with medical practices and hospitals. The job paid well enough, but it was my business that had really changed our financial situation, allowing us to buy this house, take vacations to Europe, and build what I thought was a solid foundation for our future. I was checking my business banking app, a daily ritual that had become second nature, when something caught my attention. A notification from our joint savings account, the one we used for household expenses and shared goals. The balance was lower than I expected, significantly lower. I frowned, thinking there might be a delay in processing or maybe I was remembering wrong. We had been talking about updating the master bathroom, and I knew Marcus had been getting quotes from contractors, but nothing that should have impacted our account to this degree. I switched to the desktop version of our bank's website, entering my login credentials with the kind of automatic muscle memory that comes from years of managing finances. The full statement loaded, and my coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. Over the past 2 months, there had been a series of transfers I didn't recognize. Not small amounts either. Transfers of $3,000, $5,000, $8,000, all going to an account I'd never seen before. The descriptions were vague, labeled simply as personal transfer or family assistance, but they added up to something that made my stomach drop. I grabbed a notepad from the kitchen drawer and started writing down dates and amounts, my handwriting getting shakier with each entry. February 15th, $4,000. February 22nd, $6,000. March 3rd, $7,500. The pattern was erratic but consistent. Always significant amounts, always transferred on weekdays when I was typically buried in client work and not monitoring our accounts as closely. The front door opened with its familiar creak, and I could hear Marcus's running shoes squeaking against the tile entryway. He always made a point of cooling down in the garage before coming inside, something about not wanting to track sweat through the house. I quickly closed the laptop and tried to arrange my face into something that looked normal, though my heart was beating fast enough that I worried he might notice. "Morning, babe," he called out, his voice carrying that slightly breathless quality of someone who'd just finished exercising. "How'd you sleep?" "Fine," I managed, taking a sip of coffee that now tasted bitter. "Good run?" He appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in his running gear, hair damp with sweat and cheeks flushed. Marcus was handsome in that conventional way that had first attracted me when we met at a friend's barbecue 7 years ago. Clean-cut features, easy smile, the kind of confidence that came from success in sales. But looking at him now, I found myself studying his expression for signs of deception, wondering what else I might have missed. "Yeah, great run. Thinking about signing up for that half marathon in November. You know, the one that goes through Tempe Town Lake?" He moved toward the refrigerator, pulling out a bottle of coconut water. "Might be fun to have a goal to work toward." I nodded, making appropriate sounds of encouragement while my mind raced through possibilities. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe he was planning a surprise, or helping out a family member who was in trouble. Maybe I was overreacting to what could be perfectly innocent financial management that we simply hadn't discussed yet. "Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I was looking at our savings account this morning, and I noticed some transfers I didn't recognize. Do you know anything about those?" The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. A slight tightening around his eyes, a pause that lasted just a fraction too long before he answered. "Oh yeah, I've been helping out my sister with some expenses. You know how things have been tight for her since the divorce." His sister Lisa lived in Denver and worked as a nurse. I liked her well enough, though we weren't particularly close, and I knew she'd gone through a difficult separation the previous year. It was plausible that she might need financial help, and Marcus had always been protective of his family. But something about the way he said it, the quickness of the explanation, made me suspicious. "That's really generous of you," I said carefully. "How much have you been sending her?" "Not too much. Just a few thousand here and there to help her get back on her feet." He was already moving toward the hallway, heading for the shower. "I should have mentioned it, but you've been so busy with the Peterson campaign, I didn't want to add to your stress." The Peterson campaign was indeed consuming most of my attention, a complex rebranding project for a chain of luxury hotels that required extensive travel and coordination with multiple teams. It was the kind of high-stakes, high-reward project that could establish my firm as a major player in the hospitality sector. Marcus knew how important it was to me, and he also knew that when I was deep in a project like this, I tended to let other things slide. After he disappeared upstairs, I reopened my laptop and printed out the bank statements, studying them more carefully. The timing of the transfers didn't feel random anymore. They seemed to coincide with Marcus's business trips, which had become more frequent over the past few months. He'd mentioned picking up additional territory, expanding his client base. But now I wondered if there was more to those trips than pharmaceutical sales calls. I spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on work, but my concentration was fractured. During a strategy meeting with my team, I found myself staring out the conference room window, barely registering the discussion about social media metrics and brand positioning. My assistant Sarah had to repeat a question twice before I snapped. Back to attention. "Sorry," I said, shuffling through papers I hadn't actually been reading. "Long night." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Can you run that by me again? Sarah was 26, sharp as a knife, and had been with me for almost 2 years. She had an intuitive understanding of digital marketing that complemented my strategic background, and I'd come to rely on her insights more than I probably should have. She was also observant enough to notice when something was off. "Are you okay, Riza? You seem distracted today." "And just some personal stuff," I said, which was true enough. Nothing that should affect the Peterson timeline. But as the day wore on, I realized I couldn't concentrate on anything until I had answers. I called the bank during my lunch break. speaking to a customer service representative who confirmed that yes, those transfers had been authorized by Marcus using his access to our joint account. Everything was legitimate from a technical standpoint. He had every right to move that money, just as I did. That evening, Marcus came home with flowers, a bouquet of white roses that he presented with a flourish and an apologetic smile. "I know, I should have talked to you about helping Lisa," he said, kissing my cheek. "I just didn't want you to worry about it on top of everything else you're dealing with." The gesture felt calculated in a way that made my skin crawl, but I accepted the flowers and arranged them in a vase while he talked about his day. He'd driven up to Flagstaff to meet with a new practice, he said, and had stopped at that little cafe we'd visited together on a weekend trip last fall. He remembered I liked their lavender shortbread and had brought some home for me. It was thoughtful. It was exactly the kind of thing the Marcus I'd married would do. But it also felt like performance, like he was working too hard to seem normal. I found myself analyzing every word, every gesture, looking for cracks in a facade I was only just beginning to recognize. Over the next few days, I became a detective in my own life. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The way Marcus's phone was always face down when he left it on the counter. How he'd developed a habit of taking calls in the garage or stepping outside when his phone rang. The new cologne he'd started wearing, something spicier and more expensive than his usual brand. The fact that he'd become very particular about doing his own laundry, especially his dress shirts. I also started checking our bank accounts more frequently, and the transfers continued. Smaller amounts now, as if he'd noticed my attention and was trying to be more subtle. But they were still there. Still consistent, still unexplained despite his story about helping his sister. On Thursday afternoon, I did something I'd never done before in our relationship. I called Lisa directly. "Riza, what a nice surprise," she said, her voice genuinely warm. "How are you? How's the business?" We chatted for a few minutes about work and life, and then I carefully steered the conversation toward her financial situation. "Marcus mentioned you've been going through a tough time since the divorce. I hope things are starting to look up for you." There was a pause. "It's been challenging, but I'm managing okay. The settlement actually worked out better than I expected, and I've been picking up extra shifts at the hospital. Why do you ask?" My heart sank, even as part of me felt vindicated. "Oh, no reason. Just wanted to make sure you were doing all right. You know how Marcus worries about family." "He's sweet that way," Lisa agreed. "Though, honestly, I've been feeling guilty about not staying in touch better. I keep meaning to call, but you know how it is." After we hung up, I sat in my office, staring at the wall for a long time. Lisa wasn't receiving money from Marcus, which meant he was lying about where those transfers were going. Which meant I needed to find out who was actually getting our money and why. That night, I waited until Marcus was asleep before quietly retrieving his phone from the nightstand. I'd never felt the need to snoop through his private communications before, but desperate times call for desperate measures. His passcode had always been my birthday, a sweet gesture that now felt ironic as I used it to invade his privacy. His text messages were mostly work-related, conversations with colleagues about client meetings and sales targets. But there was one thread that made my blood run cold. A contact listed simply as J, with a string of messages that told a story I wasn't prepared to read. "Can't wait to see you next week. The spa package was incredible, thank you, baby. I miss you already. When can you get away again?" I scrolled back through weeks of messages, watching my marriage disintegrate in real time through emoji hearts and photos I didn't want to examine too closely. The timeline matched the bank transfers perfectly. Every trip, every client meeting, every late night at the office corresponded with increased activity in this thread. The most recent exchange was from earlier that day. Marcus: "Dinner at Nobu tomorrow? The reservation is at 7. J: "Perfect. Can't wait to wear the dress. You got me. Nobu." The Japanese restaurant downtown where Marcus had taken me for our anniversary 2 years ago, where he was apparently taking his mistress tomorrow night while I thought he was having dinner with potential clients. I took screenshots of everything, my hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Then I carefully placed his phone back exactly where I'd found it and went downstairs to think. The kitchen was dark, except for the under-cabinet lighting I'd left on, casting everything in a warm glow that felt absurdly peaceful given the circumstances. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the breakfast bar, staring out at our backyard pool, its surface perfectly still in the desert air. 5 years of marriage, 7 years together, a shared life that included this house, joint financial accounts, future plans that now seemed like fiction. I thought about all the times I'd worked late while Marcus claimed to be doing the same. All the business trips that had seemed perfectly reasonable. All the small changes in his behavior that I'd attributed to natural evolution rather than deception. But underneath the hurt and betrayal, something else was building. Something harder and more focused. Because Marcus had made a crucial mistake in his calculation. He thought our joint savings account represented the extent of our wealth. He thought that by gradually draining it, he was funding his affair with our money. What he didn't know was that I'd been moving money for months, not to hide it from him, but to protect it. My business had been generating significant profits, and I'd been working with a financial advisor to diversify our investments and protect our assets. I'd opened separate business accounts, established a trust, and moved the majority of our actual wealth into vehicles that weren't connected to our day-to-day banking. The money Marcus was stealing represented maybe 15% of our total assets. He was so focused on what he could see that he'd never bothered to understand the full scope of what I'd built. In his mind, he was the primary breadwinner despite my business success, and he'd never paid close attention to the financial strategies I'd implemented. I pulled out my laptop and logged into my business banking portal, looking at numbers that would have shocked Marcus if he'd ever bothered to ask. My company had just closed its best quarter ever, with signed contracts extending well into the next year. The Peterson campaign alone was worth more than Marcus made in 6 months, and none of it was accessible through the accounts he knew about. Sitting there in my kitchen at 2 a.m, I started planning, not just how to confront him, but how to protect myself and ensure that his betrayal would cost him far more than he'd ever imagined. Because if Marcus wanted to play games with our financial security, I was going to show him what a real strategist could accomplish. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in over a year. I had research to do, and I couldn't afford to be distracted by client calls and strategy meetings. Marcus left for the office at his usual time, kissing me goodbye with the same casual affection he'd shown for months while conducting his affair. I wondered if he was already thinking about his dinner date, already anticipating another evening, spent spending our money on someone else. After his car disappeared down the street, I got dressed and drove to my bank. I'd been a customer of First National for almost a decade, and my relationship with the business banking team had always been professional and productive. I asked to speak with Mr. Thompson, the branch manager who'd helped me establish my business, accounts. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, shaking my hand with genuine warmth. "Good to see you. How can I help you today?" "I need to make some changes to my account structure," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Both personal and business. I'm concerned about asset protection." We spent the next 2 hours going through my options. I moved the remaining funds from our joint accounts into a new personal account that only I could access. I established additional business entities that would shield my company's assets from any potential legal challenges. And I documented everything, creating a paper trail that would be impossible to dispute. Mr. Thompson was thorough and professional, asking exactly the right questions to ensure I understood the implications of each decision. He didn't pry into my motivations, but I could see the concern in his eyes when I explained that I needed to protect my assets from a potentially contentious domestic situation. I want to make sure I understand correctly, he said, reviewing the paperwork we'd prepared. You're essentially separating all of your personal wealth from any joint holdings with your spouse. That's correct, I confirmed, and I want it done immediately. By the time I left the bank, Marcus's access to our shared finances had been legally and completely severed. He could still access the checking account we used for daily expenses, but everything else was now beyond his reach. More importantly, if he tried to make any additional large transfers, he'd discover that the accounts he'd been raiding were effectively empty. That afternoon, I drove to a coffee shop near downtown Phoenix and called my attorney. David Chen had handled the legal work when I established my business, and I trusted him to be both discreet and ruthlessly effective. I explained the situation in broad terms, focusing on the financial aspects rather than the emotional devastation. I need to know what my options are, I said, stirring sugar into my latte while watching office workers hurry past the window. Both for recovering the money he's already taken and for protecting myself going forward. David was quiet for a moment, processing the information. How much are we talking about? Around $60,000 from our joint savings, as far as I can tell. But David, there's more to this than just the money. I have reason to believe this is part of an ongoing pattern of deception. Infidelity? Yes. Another pause. Riza, I need you to understand that this changes the landscape significantly. If you're considering divorce, and if you can prove that he was using marital assets to fund an extramarital relationship, that's something the court will take very seriously. What do I need to prove it? Documentation. Financial records showing the transfers, evidence of the relationship, anything that establishes a pattern of misconduct. Arizona is a no-fault divorce state, but when it comes to property division, using marital assets for an affair can definitely impact the outcome. I thought about the screenshots on my phone, the bank statements I'd printed, the evidence I'd been gathering without fully realizing that's what I was doing. I can get you documentation, I said. We agreed to meet the following week to discuss strategy in more detail. For now, David advised me to continue gathering evidence while avoiding any confrontation that might alert Marcus to my suspicions. The goal was to build an airtight case before revealing my hand. That evening, I cooked Marcus's favorite dinner. Grilled salmon with lemon butter, roasted asparagus, wild rice pilaf. I opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for a special occasion and lit candles in the dining room. When he walked in and saw the setup, his face lit up with genuine surprise and what looked like relief. "What's all this for?" he asked, loosening his tie and rolling up his sleeves. "Do I need a reason to cook a nice dinner for my husband?" I replied, accepting his kiss and marveling at my own ability to maintain this charade. We ate and talked about our days, his story about client meetings delivered with the same practiced ease I'd once found charming. He asked about my work, seemed genuinely interested in the Peterson campaign's progress, and complimented the meal with the kind of attention that suggested he was working to be a better husband. It was almost convincing. If I hadn't seen his text messages, hadn't traced the money transfers, hadn't spoken to his sister, I might have believed that we were simply going through a rough patch that could be resolved with better communication and more effort. Instead, I found myself studying him like a case study in deception, noting the way he checked his phone whenever he thought I wasn't looking, how he volunteered slightly too much detail about his day, the careful way he avoided mentioning any specific restaurant where he'd had lunch. After dinner, we watched a movie together on the couch, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that had once felt like home and now felt like a lie. When his phone buzzed with a text message, he glanced at it and then casually set it aside without responding. "Work?" I asked. "Yeah, just scheduling stuff for next week," he said, but I'd seen enough of the screen to catch the name. Jay, his mistress, probably wondering why he wasn't responding to whatever message she'd sent. That night, after Marcus fell asleep, I lay in our bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about timing. I could confront him immediately, armed with everything I'd discovered. I could file for divorce and begin the legal process of ending our marriage. Or I could wait, continue gathering evidence, and choose the moment of revelation for maximum impact. The strategic part of my brain, the part that had built a successful business by thinking several moves ahead, voted for patience. Marcus thought he was in control of this situation. He believed he was successfully managing 2 relationships while maintaining his financial access to our shared resources. He had no idea that I'd already moved most of our assets beyond his reach, or that I was building a case that would ensure his betrayal cost him everything. But there was another consideration, one that went beyond financial strategy or legal positioning. Marcus was planning to have dinner with his mistress at one of the most expensive restaurants in Phoenix, probably ordering wine that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a week. He was going to pay for this dinner with money he'd stolen from our savings account, money that should have been going toward our future together. The audacity of it was breathtaking, and it gave me an idea that was either brilliant or completely reckless. Instead of confronting him privately, instead of filing papers and beginning a drawn-out legal process, what if I gave him exactly what he seemed to want? What if I let him have his perfect evening with his mistress, complete with expensive wine, an intimate conversation, right up until the moment when his stolen credit card was declined? Because I was the primary account holder on most of our financial instruments. Because I'd already moved our assets to accounts he couldn't access. And because sometimes the most effective revenge isn't just taking back what's yours, it's making sure everyone knows exactly why you're taking it back. I smiled in the darkness, finally feeling like myself again for the first time in days. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Marcus was already in the shower, humming some tune I didn't recognize. Probably something his mistress had introduced him to. I lay in bed listening to the sound of running water and made a decision that would change everything. Today wasn't just about gathering more evidence. Today was about understanding the full scope of what I was dealing with. I waited until Marcus left for work, watching from our bedroom window as his silver Audi backed out of the driveway. He'd dressed more carefully than usual, choosing a shirt I'd bought him for Christmas and the cologne that had started appearing on our credit card statements 3 months ago. Everything about his preparation suggested this wasn't just another day of pharmaceutical sales calls. After his taillights disappeared around the corner, I got dressed and drove to a part of Phoenix I rarely visited. Sarah had recommended a private investigator last year when one of our clients suspected employee theft, and I'd kept the business card tucked in my desk drawer without ever imagining I'd need those services myself. The office was in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a nail salon, which somehow made it feel both legitimate and discreet. Margaret Wells was nothing like the grizzled detective I'd expected from movies and television shows. She was probably in her early 50s, wearing a crisp blazer and practical heels, with the kind of professional demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Her office was small but organized, dominated by filing cabinets and a desk covered with manila folders. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "what can I help you with today?" I explained the situation as objectively as possible, focusing on the financial discrepancies and suspicious behavior rather than the emotional impact. Margaret took notes in a small leather notebook, asking pointed questions about timelines, Marcus's work schedule, and the evidence I'd already gathered. "You mentioned text messages," she said, looking up from her notes. "Do you still have access to his phone?" "Only when he's sleeping or in the shower," I admitted. "He's become very protective of it lately." That's not uncommon in these situations. People having affairs often become hyper-vigilant about digital security, even when they've been careless in other areas. She leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I have to ask, what's your end game here? Are you looking to save your marriage or end it?" The question caught me off guard, even though I should have expected it. I honestly Don't know yet, but I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I make any major decisions. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's smart. Too many people make irreversible choices based on incomplete information. Here's what I can do for you. I can conduct surveillance of your husband's activities, document any meetings or relationships that might be relevant, and provide you with a comprehensive report that would hold up in legal proceedings if necessary. We discussed logistics and pricing, which was more reasonable than I'd expected. Margaret explained that most infidelity investigations could be resolved within a week or two, depending on the subject's patterns and how careful they were being about their activities. One more thing, she said as I prepared to leave. You mentioned that tonight he's supposed to have dinner with this woman. That could be an excellent opportunity to gather definitive proof if you're comfortable with the idea of documented surveillance. I thought about Marcus getting ready for his evening with his mistress, probably looking forward to another expensive meal paid for with money he'd stolen from our savings. Yes, I said without hesitation. I want everything documented. After leaving Margaret's office, I drove to my own workplace, a converted warehouse in the arts district that housed my marketing firm, along with several other small businesses. The space had exposed brick walls and industrial lighting that created exactly the kind of creative atmosphere I'd envisioned when I signed the lease 4 years ago. My team was already deep into their morning routines, and I tried to slip into my office without drawing attention to my late arrival. Riza? Sarah appeared in my doorway almost immediately, holding a coffee mug and wearing the concerned expression I'd been seeing too often lately. The Peterson team called looking for you about an hour ago. Something about changes to the campaign timeline. I checked my phone and saw 3 missed calls and a string of text messages. The Peterson account was worth more than any other project we'd handled, and I couldn't afford to let my personal crisis impact my professional responsibilities. Can you set up a conference call for this afternoon? I need to review their latest feedback before we discuss any timeline changes. Already done. 3 o'clock. Sarah hesitated in the doorway. Are you sure you're okay? You've seemed really distracted lately, and that's not like you. Sarah had been with me long enough to recognize when something was seriously wrong, and her concern was both touching and problematic. I needed to maintain some semblance of normalcy at work while my personal life imploded, but I was discovering that compartmentalization was harder than I'd expected. I'm dealing with some personal issues, I said carefully. Nothing that should affect our work, but I appreciate you picking up the slack while I sort things out. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of client calls and strategy meetings, but I found myself constantly checking the clock and thinking about Marcus. Was he planning his evening while sitting in some medical office waiting room? Was he texting his mistress between sales presentations? The thought of him conducting his affair while maintaining the facade of our marriage made my stomach turn. During lunch, I received a call from David, my attorney. Riza, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want to make sure you understand something important. If you're planning to file for divorce, the actions you take in the next few weeks could significantly impact the eventual settlement. What do you mean? Arizona is a community property state, which means that generally speaking, assets acquired during marriage are split equally between spouses. However, there are exceptions when one party has engaged in wasteful dissipation of marital assets. The money your husband has been transferring to fund his affair could be considered dissipation, which means you might be entitled to reimbursement. I was taking notes as he spoke, my marketing brain automatically organizing the information into actionable categories. So the more evidence I have of him using our money for the affair, the stronger my position becomes. Exactly. But here's the crucial part. You need to be careful not to engage in any behavior that could be construed as dissipation yourself. Moving money to protect it is one thing, but spending it vindictively or hiding it improperly could hurt your case. After we hung up, I sat in my office thinking about the implications of what David had told me. The money Marcus had stolen wasn't just gone. It was evidence of his betrayal that could work in my favor during divorce proceedings. Every expensive dinner, every gift to his mistress, every romantic weekend funded with our savings was building. A case for why I deserved a larger share of our marital assets. But there was something else David had said that stuck with me. The phrase, wasteful dissipation, kept running through my mind, and I realized that Marcus wasn't just stealing money from our marriage. He was being wasteful about it, spending extravagantly on someone else while I worked 60-hour weeks to build our financial security. That afternoon, during the Peterson conference call, I found myself arguing passionately for a more aggressive marketing strategy, pushing back against the client's conservative approach with an intensity that surprised everyone on the call. When we hung up, Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," she said. "You just convinced them to double their digital advertising budget in 30 minutes. Sometimes people need to be pushed out of their comfort zones." I replied, but I knew the real source of my intensity had nothing to do with marketing strategy and everything to do with the anger I was struggling to contain. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself obsessively checking the time. Marcus would be leaving work soon, probably going home to shower and change before meeting his mistress. Margaret had confirmed that she would be conducting surveillance, starting at 6 o'clock, positioning herself near the restaurant to document whatever happened. At 5:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Working late tonight. Client dinner ran long. Don't wait up." The casual lie, delivered via text message like it was nothing more than a scheduling update, made my hand shake with rage. He was probably already getting ready for his romantic evening, and he couldn't even be bothered to call with his fabricated excuse. I gathered my things and told my team I was heading home early, claiming I had a headache that wasn't entirely fictional. The drive back to Scottsdale felt surreal, knowing that I was returning to an empty house while my husband prepared to spend the evening with another woman. But instead of the devastation I'd expected to feel, I was surprised by a growing sense of anticipation. Tonight, everything would become real. Margaret would document Marcus's affair, providing me with the kind of evidence that couldn't be explained, away or dismissed. And more importantly, Marcus would discover that his access to our money wasn't as secure as he'd assumed. I'd spent the morning working with Mr. Thompson to set up automatic alerts on all of our accounts. If Marcus tried to use any of our credit cards for charges over $100, I would receive an immediate notification. More importantly, I'd arranged for our primary credit card to be temporarily suspended after 7 o'clock, ostensibly, for suspicious activity that would require identity verification to resolve. The timing wasn't accidental. Marcus and his mistress would be able to order dinner and probably get through their appetizers before the card was declined. They might even make it to the main course, depending on how the restaurant processed payments. But when the bill came, Marcus would face the humiliation of having his card rejected in front of the woman he was trying to impress. I imagined him fumbling for explanations, maybe trying to blame the bank or claiming there was some kind of technical error. Would he have enough cash to cover a dinner at Nobu? Would his mistress offer to pay, or would she sit there in uncomfortable silence while he called the bank from the restaurant? The scenario played out in my mind like a movie I couldn't wait to watch. By 6 o'clock, I was sitting in my kitchen with a glass of wine and my laptop, monitoring our account activity like a day trader watching stock prices. Margaret had texted to confirm she was in position, and David had sent over some preliminary paperwork for me to review. Everything was in motion, and all I had to do was wait. The first notification came at 7:15. Marcus had used our credit card at a high-end men's store, probably buying something to wear for his date. The charge was for $347, which made me wonder what kind of outfit cost that much for a single evening. The second notification came 20 minutes later, a charge at a florist for $89. He was buying flowers for his mistress with our money, probably the same kind of gesture he'd used to apologize to me just days earlier. Each notification felt like a small knife twist, but underneath the pain was a growing sense of satisfaction. Marcus was documenting his own betrayal, creating a digital trail that would be impossible to deny or explain away. Every charge was evidence of his affair, every expense a nail in the coffin of our marriage. At 8 o'clock, I received a call from an unknown number. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Margaret Wells. I wanted to give you a quick update on tonight's surveillance." "What did you find?" "Your husband arrived at the restaurant at 7:45 with a woman matching the description you provided. Blonde hair, early 30s, driving a white BMW that's registered to a Jessica Martinez. They appeared very comfortable together, suggesting this isn't their first time meeting at this location." Jessica Martinez. Now I had a full name to go, with the text messages and bank transfers. "Are you able to get photographs?" "I have everything documented." They're currently seated at a corner table, and from what I can observe, they're behaving like a couple celebrating something special. She's wearing jewelry that looks expensive, and he seems very attentive. We agreed that Margaret would continue surveillance until they left the restaurant, documenting their departure and any additional stops they might make. After hanging up, I poured myself another glass of wine and tried to process the fact that my husband was sitting in a restaurant across town, celebrating something with another woman while I sat alone in the house we'd bought together. The next notification came at 8:45. Marcus had attempted to use our credit card at Nobu for a charge of $432. But instead of the usual approval message, this one was different. "Transaction declined. Please contact your financial institution." My phone rang almost immediately. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail. He called again, and I declined that call too. The third time I answered. "Riza, thank God!" His voice was strained, barely controlled. "There's something wrong with our credit card. I'm trying to pay for dinner, and it's not working." "That's strange," I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "Where are you?" And pause. "I'm at a client dinner. The restaurant says there might be a problem with the card." "Which restaurant?" Another pause, longer this time. "It's this place downtown." "Look, can you call the bank and see what's going on? This is really embarrassing." "Of course," I said sweetly. "I'll call them right now and see if there's been some kind of mistake." "Thank you. I'll try to figure something out here, but if you could get this resolved quickly, I'd really appreciate it." After hanging up, I sat back in my chair and smiled. Marcus was trapped in a restaurant with his mistress, unable to pay for their expensive dinner, probably scrambling to come up with an explanation that wouldn't make him look like a fraud. Meanwhile, I was sitting in our kitchen with complete control over the financial accounts that he'd been raiding for months. I called the bank's customer service line and spoke to a representative about the declined charge. "I noticed there was unusual activity on our account," I explained. "Several large transfers over the past few months that my husband made without discussing them with me. I'm concerned that our account might have been compromised." The representative was helpful and professional, explaining that they could place a temporary hold on the card while they investigated the suspicious activity. I provided details about the unauthorized transfers, emphasizing that I was the primary account holder and that I hadn't approved any of the recent large expenditures. "We can resolve this by tomorrow morning," she assured me. "In the meantime, the card will remain suspended for security purposes." 20 minutes later, Marcus called again. "The bank says there's a security hold on our account," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "They won't give me any details over the phone because I'm not the primary account holder." "That's odd," I said. "I am the primary account holder. Let me call them back and see what I can find out." "Riza, I really need this resolved tonight. This dinner is important for work, and I can't exactly ask my clients to pay for their own meal." "I understand completely," I said, knowing that his clients were actually one mistress who was probably getting increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Let me see what I can do." I made a show of calling the bank again, having a lengthy conversation with the same representative about security procedures and identity verification. When I called Marcus back, I delivered the news with appropriate concern and apology. "I'm so sorry, honey. They say there's been some suspicious activity on our account, and they can't lift the hold until tomorrow morning when I can go into the branch in person with identification. Something about new federal banking regulations and identity theft prevention." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely controlled. "Are you telling me that I'm stuck here with no way to pay for dinner? Do you have cash?" I asked innocently. "Not $400 worth. What about your personal credit card? It's maxed out." The admission slipped out before he could stop himself, and I could practically hear him wince at the revelation. Maxed out. Marcus had been spending so much money on his affair that he'd exhausted his personal credit line in addition to draining our savings account. The scope of his financial deception was even worse than I'd realized. "Oh no," I said, injecting genuine sympathy into my voice. "This is such an awkward situation. Maybe you could explain to your clients that there's been a banking error? I'm sure they'd understand." "Yeah," he said, but his voice suggested he knew that conversation was going to be anything but understanding. "I'll figure something out." After we hung up, I called Margaret for an update. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is fascinating," she said, barely containing her amusement. "Your husband has been on the phone multiple times, looking increasingly agitated. The woman he's with appears confused and concerned. They're currently having what looks like an intense conversation. Are you able to hear anything?" Not the specific words, but body language suggests he's trying to explain something she's not happy about. She keeps looking around the restaurant like she's embarrassed. I imagine Jessica Martinez sitting across from Marcus as he attempted to explain why his credit card wasn't working, why he couldn't pay for the expensive dinner he'd promised her, why their romantic evening was turning into a financial crisis. She probably had no idea that the money he'd been spending on her was stolen from his wife's savings account, or that his wife was currently controlling the situation from her kitchen across town. "What happens if they can't pay?" I asked Margaret. "Most upscale restaurants will work with customers to resolve payment issues, especially if it seems like a genuine mistake rather than deliberate fraud. They might allow him to leave identification and return with payment tomorrow, or they might accept a smaller deposit and bill him for the remainder." But I knew Marcus didn't want to leave identification or promise to return tomorrow. He wanted to maintain the illusion of financial stability and romantic generosity that he'd been cultivating with Jessica. He wanted to be the successful pharmaceutical executive who could afford spontaneous, expensive dinners, not the man whose credit card got declined in front of his mistress. My phone buzzed with another call from Marcus, but this time I let it go to voicemail. When I played the message back, his voice was strained and desperate. "Riza, I really need you to call the bank again. This is turning into a disaster, and I can't just leave the restaurant without paying. Please, can you try to get this resolved tonight?" Instead of calling him back immediately, I opened my laptop and checked our account activity again. The decline charge from Nobu was listed along with all the other transactions from the day, creating a clear timeline of Marcus's preparations for his romantic evening. The men's clothing store, the florist, the restaurant, he'd planned every detail of his date with our money, right up until the moment I'd cut off his access. When I finally called him back, I could hear restaurant noise in the background and what sounded like a heated conversation in Spanish between staff members. "Marcus?" I spoke to the bank again, but I'm afraid there's nothing they can do until morning. This is really embarrassing, but is there any way your clients could cover dinner tonight and you could reimburse them tomorrow? "That's not really an option," he said through gritted teeth. "What about calling your sister? Didn't you say you've been helping her with expenses? Maybe she could return the favor?" The suggestion hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Marcus knew that I knew he'd been lying about sending money to Lisa, and now I was forcing him to confront that lie in the middle of his current crisis. "Lisa's not in a position to help right now. he said finally. "Oh, that's right. You've been sending her so much money lately." I let the implications settle before continuing. "Well, I'm sure you'll figure something out. You're good at being creative with finances." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that I hadn't expected. The satisfaction came from watching Marcus face the consequences of his deception, from seeing his carefully constructed affair disrupted by his own financial irresponsibility. But the sadness was deeper and more complex, rooted in the realization that the man I'd married was capable of this level of betrayal and dishonesty. Margaret called again at 10:30 with a final update. "They've left the restaurant," she reported. It took about an hour to resolve the payment situation, and neither of them looked happy when they walked out. The woman got into her own car and drove away without much of a goodbye. Your husband sat in his car for several minutes before leaving. "Were you able to see how they handled the bill?" It appeared that the woman ended up paying based on what I could observe through the window. She used her own credit card, and the conversation afterward didn't look pleasant. So Jessica Martinez had been forced to pay for their expensive dinner, probably wondering why the man who'd been showering her with gifts and expensive meals for months suddenly couldn't afford to pick up the check. It was a humiliation that would be difficult for Marcus to explain away, and it marked the end of his ability to maintain the illusion of unlimited financial resources. Marcus didn't come home until after midnight, and I pretended to be asleep when he finally slipped into bed beside me. He moved carefully, trying not to wake me, probably hoping to avoid any conversation about the evening's events until he'd had time to construct a believable explanation. But I lay awake long after his breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep, thinking about everything that had changed in the space of a few hours. Marcus's affair was no longer a secret I was discovering. It was a documented reality that would soon become public knowledge. His access to our financial resources was permanently severed, and his mistress had gotten a glimpse of the man behind the generous facade he'd been maintaining. Most importantly, I was no longer the unknowing victim of his betrayal. I was an active participant in determining how this story would end, and I was just getting started. The next morning, Marcus woke up before his alarm and immediately reached for his phone, probably hoping for some message from Jessica that would indicate their relationship had survived the previous night's disaster. I watched him through half-closed eyes as he scrolled through his messages, his expression growing more concerned with each passing minute. "Everything okay?" I asked, sitting up and stretching as if I was just waking up. "Yeah, just work stuff," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "How did you sleep?" "Fine. Did you get that credit card situation sorted out last night?" Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We managed to work it out. Thanks for trying to help with the bank." "Of course. I felt terrible that your client dinner was disrupted by banking nonsense." I got out of bed and started toward the bathroom, then paused as if remembering something. "By the way, I'm going to stop by the bank this morning to get that security hold resolved. I want to make sure this doesn't happen again." "Good idea," Marcus said, though he looked like he wanted to say something else. In the shower, I thought about the conversation I would have with Mr. Thompson at the bank. Not only would I be resolving the temporary hold on our credit card, but I'd also be providing him with documentation of Marcus's unauthorized transfers and fraudulent use of our accounts. The evidence Margaret had gathered, combined with the financial records I'd been collecting, would create an unassailable case of financial misconduct. By the time I got dressed and went downstairs, Marcus was already gone. He'd left earlier than usual, probably hoping to get to the office before having to face any uncomfortable questions about his evening. But he'd also left his coffee mug on the counter and forgotten to take his lunch. Small signs of distraction that suggested his carefully ordered world was beginning to unravel. I called my office and told Sarah I'd be working from home for the morning, then drove to the bank with a folder full of documentation that would change everything. Mr. Thompson was expecting me, and we spent 2 hours going through every aspect of Marcus's financial deception. Mrs. Rodriguez, he said after reviewing the evidence, this is clearly a case of unauthorized use of marital assets. We cannot only reverse the temporary hold on your credit card, but we can also initiate a fraud investigation that would prevent any future unauthorized access to your accounts. What does that mean for my husband? It means that his access to any joint accounts would be permanently revoked pending the outcome of the investigation. If charges are filed, this could become a criminal matter as well as a civil one. I signed the necessary paperwork to initiate the fraud investigation, knowing that Marcus would discover his financial exile when he tried to access any of our accounts. By the time I left the bank, every joint credit card had been canceled and replaced with new cards that only I could use. Our checking account had been converted to a single-name account, and automatic payments for all of our household expenses had been transferred to accounts that Marcus couldn't touch. But I wasn't finished. The money Marcus had stolen needed to be recovered, and Jessica Martinez needed to understand exactly who she'd been having an affair with. Margaret had provided me with Jessica's full name, address, and employment information, and a plan was beginning to form in my mind. Jessica Martinez worked as a real estate agent for a luxury firm that specialized in high-end properties throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. Her company's website featured professional photos of her standing in front of multi-million-dollar homes, smiling confidently at potential buyers who represented her primary source of income. She was attractive in a polished, professional way, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested she understood the importance of image in her line of work. What struck me most about Jessica's professional profile was how much it emphasized trust and integrity. Her bio mentioned her commitment to honest communication and ethical business practices, values that seemed somewhat inconsistent with conducting an affair with a married man. But perhaps she didn't know Marcus was married, or perhaps she simply didn't care as long as he continued funding her expensive tastes. I spent the afternoon researching Jessica's background, discovering that she'd been recently divorced and was apparently struggling to maintain the lifestyle she'd enjoyed during her marriage. Her social media accounts showed a pattern of expensive restaurants, designer clothing, and luxury vacations that seemed inconsistent with the income of a real estate agent, even a successful one. Marcus's financial contributions had probably been a welcome supplement to her own resources. That evening, I received a call from Margaret with additional information about Jessica's living situation. She's renting a condo in Old Town Scottsdale, Margaret reported. Expensive neighborhood, but the rental is significantly above what someone in her profession would typically be able to afford. It looks like your husband has been subsidizing more than just dinners and gifts. The implications were staggering. Marcus hadn't just been buying Jessica occasional presents or paying for romantic dinners. He'd been supporting her entire lifestyle, essentially funding a second household while I worked to maintain our actual home. The $60,000 he'd stolen from our savings account was probably just the tip of the iceberg. Margaret, I said, I need you to find out everything you can about Jessica's financial situation. How long has she been in that condo? What kind of car payments is she making? I want to understand the full scope of what Marcus has been paying for. I can have that information for you by tomorrow morning, Margaret replied. But Mrs. Rodriguez? I should warn you that the more involved this financial support becomes, the more complicated your divorce proceedings could be. If your husband has been essentially maintaining two households, that could be considered a form of economic abandonment. Economic abandonment. The phrase stuck with me as I prepared dinner and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy in a situation that had moved far beyond normal. Marcus had been abandoning our marriage financially, emotionally, and physically, while I'd been working to build a future that he was systematically destroying. When Marcus came home that evening, he looked exhausted and stressed in a way I hadn't seen since the early days of our marriage when he'd been struggling to establish himself in pharmaceutical sales. He moved through our house like he was walking through a minefield, clearly aware that something had shifted but not sure exactly what. "How was your day?" I asked as he sat down at the kitchen table. "Long," he said, rubbing his temples. And yours? Productive. I got that banking situation sorted out, so we shouldn't have any more problems with declined cards. Marcus looked up sharply. Good. That was really embarrassing last night. I can imagine. Your clients must have been understanding about the technical difficulties. Yeah, they were fine about it. The lie came so easily that I wondered how many others he'd told over the past few months. Did the bank explain what caused the problem? They said there had been some unusual activity on our account that triggered their fraud protection systems. Large transfers and charges that didn't match our normal spending patterns. I watched his face carefully as I spoke. They wanted to make sure someone hadn't gained unauthorized access to our accounts. Marcus's expression didn't change, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands stilled on the table. That's good that they're being careful, I guess. Absolutely. They also mentioned that they'd be monitoring our accounts more closely going forward just to make sure everything stays secure. I stood up and started preparing our dinner, keeping my tone conversational. They asked if there was anyone else who had access to our accounts who might have been making unusual transactions. What did you tell them? I said that only you and I had access, and that I hadn't made any large transfers or unusual purchases recently. I turned to face him. You haven't been making any large purchases lately, have you? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that we both understood. Marcus could confess to the transfers and try to explain them, or he could lie and hope that the bank's investigation wouldn't uncover his deception. Either choice would reveal something important about his character and his commitment to our marriage. No, he said finally. Nothing unusual. And there it was. Faced with a direct question about his financial betrayal, Marcus chose to lie to my face rather than admit what he'd been doing. The moment crystallized everything I'd been feeling over the past week, confirming that our marriage couldn't be saved and shouldn't be saved. That's what I told them, I said, turning back to the stove. I'm sure they'll figure out what caused the unusual activity. We ate dinner in relative silence, both of us pretending that everything was normal while knowing that our marriage was disintegrating in real time. Marcus checked his phone several times during the meal, probably hoping for some message from Jessica that would restore his confidence in at least one of his relationships. But Jessica Martinez wasn't responding to his messages, and she wouldn't be responding anytime soon. Because tomorrow morning, she was going to receive some information that would change her perspective on Marcus Rodriguez and the money he'd been spending on their relationship. I'd spent the afternoon crafting a letter that would accomplish several goals simultaneously. It would inform Jessica that Marcus was married, provide her with evidence of how he'd been funding their relationship, and give her an opportunity to make an informed decision about whether she wanted to continue their affair. The letter was businesslike and factual, including copies of bank statements showing the transfers Marcus had made, screenshots of text messages between them, and documentation of the financial impact his affair had been having on our marriage. I'd also included information about Jessica's rental payments and car loan, expenses that seemed to correlate with Marcus's increased financial support. But the most important part of the letter was the conclusion, where I offered Jessica a choice. She could continue her relationship with Marcus knowing that he was married and that any money he spent on her was stolen from his wife. Or she could end the relationship and help me recover the funds that had been illegally transferred to support their affair. I wasn't asking Jessica to choose between right and wrong. I was simply making sure she had all the information necessary to make an informed decision. Whatever she chose would tell me everything I needed to know about her character and would determine how I proceeded with both her and Marcus. That night, as Marcus slept beside me, I finalized the letter and prepared it for delivery. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the end of his carefully constructed deception, and I wanted to make sure that every aspect of his betrayal was exposed to the people who mattered most. Jessica Martinez was about to discover that her generous boyfriend was actually a married man who'd been stealing from his wife to fund their relationship. And Marcus was about to discover that his wife wasn't the passive victim he'd assumed she would be. The reckoning was coming, and I was ready to see exactly what kind of man I'd been married to, and what kind of woman had been sharing his bed. I woke up at 5:30 that morning, an hour before my alarm, with the kind of crystal-clear focus that comes from having a mission. Marcus was still sleeping deeply beside me, probably exhausted from the stress of managing two relationships that were both becoming increasingly complicated. I slipped out of bed quietly and went downstairs to my home office, where I'd spent the previous evening preparing what would essentially be the opening move in a very deliberate chess game. The letter to Jessica Martinez was printed and ready, along with copies of all the supporting documentation I'd gathered. Bank statements showing Marcus's transfers, screenshots of their text conversations, records of his purchases at expensive stores and restaurants. Everything was organized in a manila envelope that would arrive at her real estate office later that morning via certified mail, ensuring that she couldn't claim she'd never received it. But Jessica wasn't the only person who needed to understand the full scope of Marcus's deception. I'd been thinking about David's advice regarding wasteful dissipation of marital assets, and I realized that documenting Marcus's affair was only part of building a comprehensive case. I also needed to understand exactly how much money he'd stolen and where it had gone, not just the obvious transfers I'd already discovered. I opened my laptop and logged into every financial account we shared, methodically going through 6 months of transactions with the kind of attention to detail I usually reserved for client budget analyses. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The $60,000 in direct transfers was just the most obvious theft. There were also cash advances, purchases on credit cards I'd forgotten we had, and a pattern of smaller charges that added up to something truly staggering. Marcus had been systematic about his deception, spreading his theft across multiple accounts and payment methods to avoid creating obvious red flags. A $1,000 cash advance here, a $500 dinner charge there, luxury purchases, split between different credit cards to keep the individual amounts below levels that might trigger automatic alerts. He'd been operating like a professional embezzler, carefully managing his theft to avoid detection while maximizing his access to our resources. By the time I finished my analysis, I'd documented over $90,000 in unauthorized spending related to his affair. Not just the money transferred to Jessica directly, but also the clothes he'd bought to impress her, the hotel rooms for their romantic getaways, the expensive gifts that had appeared on our credit card statements with vague descriptions that I'd never questioned. I printed everything and organized it into a comprehensive file that would have made my business school professors proud. Financial statements, transaction histories, photographic evidence from Margaret's surveillance, copies of text messages, and a detailed timeline that showed the progression of Marcus's affair alongside the escalation of his financial theft. It was the kind of documentation that would be impossible to dispute or explain away. At 7 o'clock, I drove to a mailbox store near downtown Phoenix and sent the certified letter to Jessica Martinez. The clerk assured me it would be delivered before noon, giving Jessica the rest of the day to process the information and decide how she wanted to respond. I also mailed copies of my financial documentation to David's law office, along with a note asking him to prepare divorce papers based on the evidence I'd gathered. After leaving the mailbox store, I drove to Margaret's office to review the additional information she'd promised about Jessica's financial situation. Margaret had worked through the night, and the results of her investigation were spread across her desk like pieces of a puzzle that revealed an even more complex picture than I'd expected. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Margaret said, gesturing for me to sit down. "Your husband's financial support of Ms. Martinez goes much deeper than occasional dinners and gifts. Based on what I've been able to determine, he's been essentially funding her entire lifestyle for at least 6 months." She handed me a folder containing detailed records of Jessica's living expenses, car payments, credit card bills, and other financial obligations. The numbers were staggering. Jessica's monthly expenses totaled nearly $8,000, but her income as a real estate agent averaged less than $4,000 per month. The difference was being made up by regular cash deposits that correlated perfectly with Marcus's transfers from our accounts. "She's completely dependent on him financially," Margaret continued. "Without his support, she wouldn't be able to maintain her current lifestyle or even pay her basic living expenses. That rental condo in Old Town Scottsdale costs $3,500 a month, and her BMW lease is another $800. She's living well beyond her means because your husband is subsidizing everything." I studied the documents, feeling a mixture of anger and something that might have been pity. Jessica Martinez wasn't just Marcus's mistress. She was essentially his kept woman, entirely dependent on money stolen from our marriage to maintain her lifestyle. The power dynamic was even more twisted than I'd realized. "There's something else," Margaret said, pulling out another file. "Ms. Martinez has been advertising herself on social media as a successful luxury real estate agent, using photos taken in expensive locations and posting about high-end properties she's supposedly selling. But according to her actual sales records, she's barely making any legitimate income. The lifestyle she's presenting to the world is completely fabricated." The implications were fascinating and disturbing. Jessica had been using Marcus's financial support to create a false image of success that she was then leveraging to attract potential clients and maintain her professional reputation. She was essentially laundering stolen money through social media presentations, creating a feedback loop that made her even more dependent on Marcus's continued theft. "Margaret," I said, closing the files, "I need you to do one more thing for me. I want you to document Jessica's reaction when she receives the letter I sent this morning. I want to know how she responds when she learns the truth about where Marcus's money has been coming from." Margaret nodded approvingly. "You're thinking like a prosecutor now, Mrs. Rodriguez. The more evidence you have of both parties' knowledge and intent, the stronger your case becomes." After leaving Margaret's office, I drove to my own workplace, where I found Sarah waiting with a concerned expression and a stack of messages from clients who needed immediate attention. The Peterson campaign had reached a critical phase, and I couldn't afford to let my personal crisis continue impacting my professional responsibilities. "Riza," Sarah said, following me into my office, "I've been covering for you as much as possible, but the Peterson team is getting nervous about the timeline. They need to review the final campaign materials by Friday, and we're not quite ready." I forced myself to focus on work for the next 4 hours, diving into creative strategy and client communications with an intensity that surprised my team. But underneath my professional focus, I was constantly thinking about the letter that would be arriving at Jessica's office, wondering how she would react when she discovered that her comfortable lifestyle had been built on stolen money. At 11:30, Margaret called with an update. "Mrs. Rodriguez, the certified letter was delivered to Ms. Martinez's office 20 minutes ago. She signed for it personally, and according to my surveillance, she's currently in her office reading through the contents. Are you able to observe her reaction?" I'm positioned across the street with a telephoto lens. She appears shocked and upset, definitely not the reaction of someone who already knew the information you provided. She's made several phone calls since opening the envelope, and she's been pacing around her office looking agitated. So Jessica hadn't known that Marcus was married. The revelation was genuinely surprising to her, which meant she'd been as much a victim of his deception as I had been, at least initially. How she chose to respond now that she knew the truth would determine whether I viewed her as a fellow victim or a willing accomplice. "Keep monitoring the situation," I told Margaret. "I want to know if she tries to contact Marcus, and I want to know how long it takes her to make a decision about their relationship." The rest of the afternoon passed slowly, punctuated by client calls and meetings that felt surreal given the personal drama unfolding in parallel. Every time my phone buzzed, I wondered if it might be Jessica trying to contact me directly, or Marcus discovering that his carefully constructed world was collapsing. At 3 o'clock, Margaret called again. "Ms. Martinez left her office in a hurry about an hour ago," she reported. She drove straight to a bank downtown and spent 45 minutes inside, then went to what appears to be an attorney's office. She's currently still there. Jessica was taking action, though I wasn't sure yet what kind of action. She might be consulting a lawyer about her own legal exposure, or she might be trying to protect assets that Marcus had helped her acquire. Either way, her immediate response to learning the truth suggested that she understood the seriousness of the situation. When I arrived home that evening, Marcus was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and papers spread around him. He looked up when I walked in, and I could see stress etched in every line of his face. "How was your day?" I asked, setting down my purse and trying to appear casual. "Complicated," he said, closing his laptop. "Some work issues I'm trying to sort out." "Anything I can help with?" Marcus shook his head, but his expression suggested that his problems were beyond anything I could assist with. He kept checking his phone throughout our conversation, clearly waiting for some important communication that wasn't coming. "Marcus," I said, sitting down across from him, "you seem really stressed lately. Is everything okay?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. He could tell me the truth about his affair and the financial mess he'd created, or he could continue lying and hope that whatever crisis he was facing would resolve itself without involving me. "Just work pressure," he said finally. "Nothing for you to worry about." "Are you sure? Because if there's something going on that affects our family, I'd rather know about it than be blindsided later." The irony of my statement wasn't lost on either of us. Marcus had been blindsiding me for months with his affair and financial theft, and now I was offering him an opportunity to come clean while knowing that it was probably too late for honesty to make any difference. "I'm sure," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We ate dinner in relative silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts about problems the other person supposedly didn't know about. Marcus continued checking his phone obsessively, growing more agitated with each passing hour that brought no response from Jessica. At 8 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller ID showed David's office number, and I excused myself to take the call in my office. "Riza," David said without preamble, "I've reviewed all the documentation you sent over, and this is one of the most clear-cut cases of financial misconduct I've ever seen. Your husband has essentially been embezzling from your marriage to fund an extramarital relationship. What are our options? We can file for divorce immediately on grounds of financial misconduct and adultery. With the evidence you've gathered, I'm confident we can secure a settlement that not only protects your assets, but also requires him to make restitution for the money he's stolen." David explained the legal process in detail, outlining a strategy that would maximize my financial protection while minimizing the time and emotional energy required to resolve the divorce. The evidence I'd gathered was so comprehensive that Marcus would have very little room to negotiate or dispute the facts. "There's one more thing," David said. "If Ms. Martinez has been knowingly receiving marital assets, she could also be held liable for restitution. The fact that she's been completely dependent on your husband's financial support suggests that she was aware the money wasn't entirely legitimate." "Actually," I said, "I have reason to believe she didn't know Marcus was married until today. I sent her documentation about the situation this morning." "Interesting." Her response to that information could be very telling. If she immediately ends the relationship and offers to cooperate with asset recovery, that suggests she was an unwitting victim. If she tries to maintain the relationship or protect the assets she's received, that suggests something more problematic. After hanging up with David, I sat in my office thinking about the different ways this situation could unfold. Jessica could choose to cooperate with me in exposing Marcus's theft, essentially becoming an ally in holding him accountable for his actions. Or she could choose to protect Marcus and the lifestyle he'd been providing her, making her a willing accomplice in the continuation of his deception. Marcus's choice was more straightforward, but potentially more devastating. He could confess to everything and try to negotiate a settlement that minimized the damage to both his finances and his reputation. Or he could continue lying and fighting, dragging the process through expensive legal proceedings that would eventually expose everything anyway, while costing him even more money. At 9:30, Margaret called with the update I'd been waiting for. Mrs. Rodriguez, Ms. Martinez just left the attorney's office and drove directly to your husband's workplace. She's currently in the parking lot of his office building, apparently waiting for him to come outside. She's confronting him tonight? It appears that way. She's been sitting in her car for about 20 minutes, and she keeps checking her phone like she sent him a message asking him to meet her. I felt a surge of anticipation mixed with anxiety. Jessica had chosen to confront Marcus directly, rather than simply disappearing or trying to maintain their relationship despite learning the truth. Whatever conversation they were about to have would determine the trajectory of everything that happened next. Margaret, I need you to document this meeting if possible. I want to know what they discuss and how Marcus responds when he realizes that Jessica knows everything. I'm positioned with full surveillance equipment. You'll have a complete record of whatever happens. 20 minutes later, Margaret called back with a preliminary report. Your husband just came outside and got into Ms. Martinez's car. They're having what appears to be a very intense conversation. Lots of hand gesturing and raised voices, though I can't make out specific words from this distance. The conversation lasted 45 minutes, during which time I paced around my house trying to imagine what they might be discussing. Was Jessica demanding explanations about his marriage and the source of his money? Was Marcus trying to convince her to maintain their relationship despite the complications? Were they planning some strategy to minimize the damage to both of them? When Margaret called again, her voice carried a note of excitement. Mrs. Rodriguez, this is very interesting. Ms. Martinez just handed your husband a large envelope, said something that made him look very angry, and then drove away without any kind of goodbye. He's currently sitting alone in the parking lot reading through whatever she gave him. Any idea what was in the envelope? Based on the size and thickness, probably documents of some kind. Financial records, maybe, or legal paperwork. But whatever it was, your husband doesn't look happy about it. Marcus didn't come home until after midnight, and when he finally slipped into bed beside me, I could feel the tension radiating from his body like heat. He lay awake for hours, shifting restlessly and checking his phone repeatedly, clearly struggling with whatever Jessica had told him during their meeting. I pretended to sleep while planning my next moves. Jessica had apparently chosen to confront Marcus with the truth about their relationship, and based on Margaret's observations, the confrontation hadn't gone well for him. Whatever Jessica had given him in that envelope was serious enough to keep him awake all night, which suggested that she'd made some kind of ultimatum or threat. The next morning, Marcus left the house earlier than usual, probably hoping to avoid any conversation about his obviously sleepless night. But he'd forgotten his phone on the nightstand, and I couldn't resist the temptation to check his recent messages. What I found confirmed my suspicions about the previous night's meeting. Jessica had sent him a series of texts that told the story of their confrontation in stark detail. I can't believe you lied to me about being married. I trusted you, and you made me an accessory to stealing from your wife. The lawyer says I could be charged as an accomplice if I don't cooperate with the divorce proceedings. I'm returning everything you bought me. Don't contact me again. Your wife deserves to know everything, and I'm going to tell her. The final message had been sent at 11:30 the previous night, just before Marcus came home. Jessica. Martinez had chosen to end their relationship and cooperate with me in exposing Marcus's financial misconduct. She'd gone from being his co-conspirator to being a potential witness against him in the span of a single day. I took screenshots of all the messages and forwarded them to my own phone, adding them to the growing file of evidence that would support my divorce case. Then I carefully placed Marcus's phone back exactly where he'd left it and went downstairs to start what I knew would be a very interesting day. At 8 o'clock, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a familiar voice introduced herself. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Jessica Martinez. I believe you sent me some information yesterday about my relationship with your husband." "Yes," I said, sitting down at my kitchen table. "Thank you for calling. I want you to know that I had no idea Marcus was married when our relationship began. If I had known, I never would have gotten involved with him." Jessica's voice was steady but strained, suggesting that she'd spent considerable time preparing for this conversation. "I believe you," I said. "The question now is what we do going forward. I met with an attorney yesterday after receiving your letter. He explained that I could be held liable for receiving marital assets if I don't cooperate with your divorce proceedings. I want to make this right, Mrs. Rodriguez. I want to return everything Marcus gave me and provide you with any information that might help your case." The conversation that followed was one of the strangest I'd ever had. Jessica and I spent an hour discussing the details of her relationship with Marcus, the financial support he'd provided, and the timeline of their affair. She was forthcoming about everything, providing information that filled in gaps in my understanding of how Marcus had been managing his double life. "He told me he was recently divorced," Jessica explained. "He said he was going through a difficult time and needed someone who understood the challenges of starting over. I thought I was helping someone rebuild his life, not destroying someone else's marriage." "How much financial support did he provide?" "Everything," Jessica said without hesitation. "My rent, my car payment, my credit card bills, even my groceries. I haven't paid for anything myself in 6 months. I realize now how completely dependent I became on him and how unsustainable that was." Jessica promised to compile a complete record of everything Marcus had given her, from cash payments to expensive gifts to covered living expenses. She also agreed to meet with David to provide formal testimony about Marcus's financial conduct and the deceptive way he'd initiated their relationship. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Jessica said as our conversation wound down, "I want you to know how sorry I am about all of this. I never intended to be part of destroying a marriage, and I certainly never intended to be part of stealing money from you." "I appreciate that, Jessica. And I want you to know that I don't hold you responsible for Marcus's choices. He's the one who was married, and he's the one who chose to lie to both of us." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen feeling something I hadn't expected: relief. Jessica Martinez had chosen to do the right thing, even though it would cost her the lifestyle she'd become accustomed to and probably damage her professional reputation when the details of the affair became public knowledge. More importantly, Jessica's cooperation meant that I now had a willing witness to Marcus's financial misconduct, someone who could provide detailed testimony about how he'd been stealing money from our marriage to fund their relationship. Combined with the documentary evidence I'd already gathered, Jessica's testimony would make Marcus's defense of his actions virtually impossible. But the most satisfying aspect of Jessica's decision was what it revealed about Marcus's character. When confronted with the truth about his marriage and the consequences of his financial theft, he hadn't chosen to end the affair and try to repair the damage to our relationship. Instead, he'd apparently tried to convince Jessica to continue their relationship despite the complications, probably promising that he could manage the situation without serious consequences. Jessica's rejection of that proposal and her decision to cooperate with my divorce proceedings represented a complete collapse of Marcus's carefully constructed deception. He'd lost his mistress, his access to our financial resources, and his ability to control the narrative about his conduct. Everything he'd worked to hide was about to become public, and he was going to face the consequences entirely alone. That afternoon, I met with David to review Jessica's offer of cooperation and plan the next phase of our legal strategy. David was impressed by the comprehensive nature of the evidence we'd gathered and confident that Marcus would have no choice but to accept whatever settlement terms we proposed. "Riza," David said, reviewing the files spread across his desk, "this is the kind of case that law schools use as examples of how to build an airtight divorce proceeding. Your husband has no possible defense for his conduct, and his mistress is willing to testify against him. He's going to have to pay restitution for everything he stole, plus additional damages for the emotional distress and financial misconduct. What kind of timeline are we looking at? If he agrees to an uncontested divorce and accepts our settlement terms, we could have this resolved within 60 days. If he tries to fight it, we'll destroy him in court and he'll end up paying significantly more in both settlement costs and legal fees." David explained that we would begin by serving Marcus with divorce papers that detailed his financial misconduct and demanded immediate restitution for the stolen funds. We would also file for temporary restraining orders that would prevent him from accessing any remaining marital assets or attempting to contact Jessica Martinez. "The goal is to make it clear from the beginning that this isn't a negotiation," David said. "Your husband committed financial fraud, and he's going to pay for it. The only question is whether he wants to handle this quietly or whether he wants us to make his conduct a matter of public record." As I drove home that evening, I felt a sense of anticipation that had been building since I first discovered Marcus's affair. Tomorrow, Marcus would learn that his wife wasn't the passive victim he'd assumed she would be. He would discover that his financial theft had been thoroughly documented, that his mistress was cooperating with the divorce proceedings, and that his carefully constructed life was about to collapse in ways he'd never imagined. But more than that, tomorrow would mark the beginning of my new life. Free from a marriage that had been built on lies and sustained by theft. I'd spent months building a business that could support me independently, moving assets to protect them from Marcus's deception, and gathering evidence that would ensure justice for his betrayal. Marcus thought he'd been clever in managing his affair and hiding his financial theft, but he'd underestimated the woman he'd been stealing from, and he was about to discover exactly how costly that miscalculation would be. The morning I decided to serve Marcus with divorce papers, I woke up feeling calmer than I had in weeks. There's something profoundly liberating about moving from victim to prosecutor, from discovering betrayal to taking action against it. I had breakfast alone in our kitchen, sipping coffee while reviewing the final documents that David had prepared. Documents that would legally end our marriage while ensuring Marcus faced consequences for every dollar he'd stolen. The papers were comprehensive and damning. A petition for dissolution of marriage citing irreconcilable differences, but more importantly, a detailed accounting of Marcus's financial misconduct with demands for full restitution plus damages. David had included Jessica's sworn statement about receiving stolen marital assets, bank records showing unauthorized transfers, and a timeline that connected every romantic gesture Marcus had made to specific thefts from our accounts. Marcus left for work at his usual time, kissing me goodbye with the same casual affection he'd shown throughout our marriage, apparently believing that his world was still intact. He had no idea that Jessica had already returned most of his gifts, that his access to our finances had been permanently severed, or that a process server would be waiting for him when he arrived at his office. I'd chosen to have Marcus served at work rather than at home for strategic reasons. A public confrontation would be embarrassing for him professionally, making it clear to his colleagues that his personal conduct had become a legal matter. More importantly, serving him at the office would prevent him from having time to hide assets or prepare counter-arguments before our first formal interaction about the divorce. At 9:30, David called to confirm that the papers had been delivered. "Marcus Rodriguez was served 20 minutes ago," he reported. The process server said he looked shocked when he realized what the documents were. He's probably reading through everything right now. I imagined Marcus sitting in his office, scanning page after page of evidence that documented his betrayal in clinical legal language. Every romantic dinner with Jessica, every expensive gift, every lie he'd told about working late or traveling for business, all laid out in black and white with supporting documentation that would be impossible to dispute. How long before he calls? I asked David. Based on similar cases, probably within 2 hours. Men in his situation usually go through a predictable sequence of reactions: shock, denial, anger, and then desperate attempts to negotiate. He'll likely try to contact you directly first, then realize he needs legal representation. David was right. My phone started ringing at 11:15, Marcus's name appearing on the screen with an urgency that suggested he'd been trying to reach me for several minutes. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message while sitting in my office surrounded by client proposals and marketing strategies that suddenly felt much more manageable than they had a week ago. Riza, we need to talk immediately. There's been some kind of mistake with these legal papers. Call me back as soon as you get this. His voice carried a note of panic that I'd never heard before, the sound of a man whose carefully constructed reality had just collapsed. He called again, 10 minutes later, then again 20 minutes after that. Each voicemail became more frantic, more desperate, as he began to understand that this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding, but a deliberate legal action based on documented evidence of his misconduct. Instead of calling him back, I drove to Jessica's real estate office for a meeting we'd scheduled to finalize her cooperation with the divorce proceedings. Jessica had spent the previous day compiling records of everything Marcus had given her, from cash payments to expensive jewelry to covered living expenses, creating a comprehensive accounting that would support our claims about the scope of his financial theft. Jessica's office was in a gleaming high-rise in downtown Phoenix, the kind of building that projected success and stability to potential clients. But when I met with her that morning, she looked exhausted and stressed, clearly struggling with the professional implications of becoming involved in a high-profile divorce case. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, shaking my hand with obvious nervousness, "I want you to know how committed I am to making this right. I've returned everything Marcus gave me that I still have, and I've calculated the total value of everything I received over the past 6 months." She handed me a folder containing receipts, bank deposits, records, and a handwritten summary that totaled over $47,000 in direct financial support. The amount was staggering, representing not just expensive gifts and romantic dinners, but systematic support for Jessica's entire lifestyle. "This doesn't include the value of experiences he paid for," Jessica continued. "Vacations, spa treatments, dinners at expensive restaurants. If we included those, the total would probably be closer to $70,000. I reviewed the documentation while Jessica explained how completely dependent she'd become on Marcus's financial support. Her legitimate income as a real estate agent barely covered her basic expenses, and without Marcus's contributions, she would have to drastically downsize her lifestyle or face financial crisis. "What will you do now?" I asked. "I'm moving to a smaller apartment and selling my car to pay off the lease on the BMW Marcus was covering. I've also accepted that my professional reputation will probably suffer when this becomes public, but I'd rather deal with that than continue benefiting from stolen money." Jessica's willingness to sacrifice her lifestyle to do the right thing was impressive, especially considering that Marcus had apparently tried to convince her to maintain their relationship despite the complications. Her cooperation would be crucial in demonstrating that Marcus's affair had involved substantial financial misconduct rather than just emotional betrayal. After leaving Jessica's office, I returned home to find 17 missed calls from Marcus and a string of increasingly desperate text messages. He'd apparently left work early and driven home, where he'd discovered that I wasn't answering my phone or responding to his attempts at communication. His final text message was different from the others, more calculating and less desperate. "I know you're angry, but we can work this out without lawyers and publicity. Let's talk tonight when I get home. We both have things we'd prefer to keep private." The implied threat was obvious. Marcus was suggesting that he had information about me that could be damaging if made public, probably hoping to leverage some kind of mutual assured destruction scenario where we both agreed to keep each other's secrets. But I'd been careful to ensure that my own conduct throughout this situation was legally and ethically sound, and I had no secrets that could compare to systematic financial theft and adultery. That evening, Marcus came home carrying flowers and wearing the expression of a man who'd spent the day calculating how to minimize damage to his reputation and finances. He found me in the kitchen, preparing dinner as if nothing had changed, as if our marriage hadn't been legally dissolved that morning. "Riza," he said, setting the flowers on the counter with exaggerated care, "we need to discuss this situation rationally. I think there's been some miscommunication about my relationship with Jessica and the financial arrangements we made." Miscommunication? I turned to face him, genuinely curious about how he planned to reframe months of deliberate deception as a simple misunderstanding. "Look, I should have told you about Jessica from the beginning. I know that. But our marriage has been struggling for months, and I found someone who made me feel appreciated. The money I spent on her wasn't theft. It was my attempt to find happiness in a relationship that wasn't working." Marcus's ability to recast his betrayal as somehow justified by problems in our marriage was breathtaking in its audacity. He was essentially arguing that stealing money to fund an affair was acceptable because he felt unappreciated at home, a logic that revealed more about his character than any evidence I could have gathered. "So you're saying that the $60,000 you transferred without my knowledge was justified because you were unhappy?" I asked. "I'm saying that marriages are complicated, and sometimes people make mistakes when they're trying to find their way back to happiness. Jessica understood me in ways that you haven't for a long time." I let that statement hang in the air between us, marveling at Marcus's complete inability to take responsibility for his actions. In his version of events, I was somehow responsible for driving him to steal money and conduct an affair, as if his betrayal was a natural response to marital difficulties rather than a deliberate choice to prioritize his own desires over our shared commitments. "Marcus," I said finally, "Jessica ended your relationship because she discovered you were lying to her about being married. She's cooperating with my divorce attorney and returning everything you bought her. She understands that what you did was theft, even if you don't." The information hit Marcus like a physical blow. His carefully prepared arguments about marital problems and miscommunication crumbled as he realized that Jessica had chosen to side with me rather than maintaining their relationship despite the complications. "She can't do that," he said, his voice rising. "She accepted those gifts freely. She can't just decide retroactively that they were inappropriate." "Actually, she can, and she has." Jessica hired her own attorney, who explained that receiving stolen marital assets could make her an accessory to your financial misconduct. She chose to cooperate with the divorce proceedings rather than face potential criminal charges. Marcus sat down heavily at our kitchen table, finally beginning to understand the scope of the legal jeopardy he was facing. His affair wasn't just a personal betrayal that could be resolved through marriage counseling. It was documented financial misconduct that could result in both civil and criminal consequences. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want full restitution for every dollar you stole, plus damages for the emotional distress and financial harm you caused. I want you to agree to an uncontested divorce that splits our remaining assets according to Arizona community property law. And I want you to acknowledge publicly that you committed financial misconduct during our marriage." "You want me to admit to criminal behavior?" "I want you to admit to the truth. You stole money from our marriage to fund an extramarital affair. That's not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It's a documented fact, supported by bank records, witness testimony, and your own text messages." Marcus was quiet for a long time, probably weighing his options and realizing that none of them were particularly good. He could fight the divorce and force everything into public court proceedings that would expose every detail of his conduct, or he could accept responsibility and try to minimize the damage to his reputation and finances. "If I agree to your terms," he said finally, "will you keep this out of the media?" "I have no interest in publicizing your affair, Marcus. But I won't agree to any confidentiality provisions that prevent me from discussing what happened or protect you from the natural consequences of your actions." The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus alternately trying to justify his behavior, minimize the financial impact of his theft, and negotiate terms that would protect his professional reputation. But every argument he made was undermined by the comprehensive evidence I'd gathered and Jessica's willingness to testify about their relationship. By the end of the evening, Marcus had agreed in principle to the divorce terms David had proposed, though he insisted on hiring his own attorney to review the settlement agreement before signing anything. He would pay full restitution for the stolen money, accept an unequal division of our remaining assets that reflected his misconduct, and agree to an expedited divorce process that would minimize publicity. "There's one more thing," I said, as Marcus prepared to leave for what would be his final night in our house. "I want you to understand that this wasn't just about the money or even about the affair. It was about the fact that when I gave you opportunities to tell me the truth, you chose to lie to my face." "When did you give me opportunities?" "Every time I asked about the missing money. Every time I asked about your work schedule or your travel plans. Every time I suggested we work on our marriage or spend more time together. You had dozens of chances to be honest, and you chose deception. Every single time." Marcus left that night to stay in a hotel, and I spent the evening alone in our house for the first time since discovering his affair. The silence felt different from the tense quiet that had characterized our interactions over the past week. It was peaceful rather than fraught, full of possibility rather than dread. 3 days later, Marcus's attorney contacted David to confirm that his client would accept our settlement terms rather than contest the divorce. The process that I'd initiated by discovering suspicious bank transfers would be resolved within 60 days, leaving me financially secure and legally free from a marriage that had been built on lies. But the most satisfying outcome wasn't the financial restitution or the legal vindication. It was the knowledge that I'd refused to be a passive victim of Marcus's betrayal. Instead of accepting his deception or trying to preserve a marriage that was built on theft and lies, I'd taken action to protect myself and ensure that he faced consequences for his misconduct. Jessica Martinez had made similar choices, sacrificing a comfortable lifestyle to do the right thing when confronted with evidence of Marcus's deception. Together, we demonstrated that Marcus's charm and manipulation couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions when the women he'd deceived chose to hold him accountable. The confrontation I'd planned and executed wasn't just about ending my marriage or recovering stolen money. It was about refusing to accept betrayal as something I had to endure silently, and instead choosing to fight for the truth and for justice, even when that fight was difficult and painful. Marcus had underestimated the woman he'd been stealing from, and that miscalculation had cost him everything he'd worked to gain through his deception. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't elaborate or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply refusing to be silent and insisting that the truth be acknowledged and justice be served. 6 weeks after serving Marcus with divorce papers, I was sitting in David's law office signing the final settlement agreement that would officially end our marriage. The process had moved more quickly than either of us had expected, largely because Marcus's attorney had advised him that fighting the divorce would only result in more expensive legal fees and greater public exposure of his misconduct. The settlement terms were everything I'd hoped for and more. Marcus would pay full restitution of $93,000 for the money he'd stolen, plus an additional $50,000 in damages for emotional distress and the costs of the investigation. Our house would be sold with the proceeds going entirely to me, since it had been purchased primarily with income from my business. Marcus would keep his retirement accounts and his car, but everything else would be divided in my favor to compensate for his financial misconduct. "Mrs. Rodriguez," David said, reviewing the final documents, "this is one of the most favorable divorce settlements I've negotiated in 20 years of practice. Your ex-husband is essentially paying you $250,000 to end this. Marriage quietly." The money was satisfying, but it wasn't the most important victory I'd achieved. More significant was the knowledge that Marcus would face consequences for his betrayal that extended far beyond our divorce. His theft had been reported to his employer, resulting in his termination from the pharmaceutical company where he'd worked for 8 years. His professional reputation in Phoenix was essentially destroyed, making it unlikely he'd find comparable employment in the same city where he'd conducted his affair. Jessica Martinez had also paid a price for her involvement in Marcus's deception, though she'd handled the consequences with more grace than he had. Her real estate career had suffered when news of the affair became public within the tight-knit luxury property market, but she'd responded by transitioning to a different firm and focusing on more modest residential sales. She'd also moved to a smaller apartment and sold her BMW, using the proceeds to pay off credit card debt that had accumulated while Marcus was supporting her lifestyle. Most importantly, Jessica had followed through on her promise to cooperate fully with the divorce proceedings. Her testimony had been crucial in establishing the scope of Marcus's financial misconduct, and her willingness to return his gifts had demonstrated that she understood the difference between accepting legitimate presents and receiving stolen property. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected phone call from Jessica. We hadn't spoken since the legal proceedings ended, and I wasn't sure what kind of relationship, if any, was appropriate between 2 women who'd been unknowingly sharing the same man. "Riza," Jessica said, "I wanted to call and thank you for the way you handled this entire situation. I know I was part of something that hurt you deeply, and you could have made my life much more difficult than you did." "You were a victim of Marcus's deception too," I replied. "Once you learned the truth, you made the right choices." "I did, but only because you showed me what the right choices looked like. Watching you take control of the situation and refuse to be a victim taught me something important about standing up for yourself." Jessica went on to explain that the experience had motivated her to make significant changes in her life beyond just ending the affair. She'd enrolled in business courses to improve her legitimate earning potential, joined a support group for people recovering from financially dependent relationships, and started volunteering with an organization that helped women achieve financial independence. I realized that my relationship with Marcus wasn't just inappropriate because he was married, Jessica said. It was unhealthy because I'd become completely dependent on someone else's financial support. That kind of dependency makes you vulnerable to manipulation and poor decision-making. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and by the end, I felt something I hadn't expected. Genuine respect for Jessica's efforts to rebuild her life in a more sustainable and ethical way. She'd learned from her mistakes and was working to ensure she never found herself in a similar situation again. 6 months after the divorce, I was featured in a Phoenix Business Journal article about successful women entrepreneurs who'd overcome personal challenges to build thriving companies. The article focused on my marketing firm's recent expansion and didn't mention my divorce specifically, but it did discuss the importance of financial independence and the strength that comes from building something entirely your own. Success. In business isn't just about profit margins and client satisfaction, I was quoted as saying. It's about creating security and independence that no one can take away from you. When you build something with your own hands and your own vision, you have power that doesn't depend on anyone else's choices or behavior. The article generated several new client inquiries and led to speaking opportunities at women's business organizations throughout Arizona. I discovered that my experience with Marcus's betrayal and my response to it resonated with many other women who'd faced similar challenges in their personal and professional lives. 1 year after serving Marcus with divorce papers, I was contacted by a television producer who wanted to interview me for a documentary about financial infidelity and divorce. The producer had learned about my case through legal circles and was impressed by the systematic way I documented Marcus's misconduct and protected my own assets. "Mrs. Vega," the producer said during our initial phone conversation, "your case represents something that happens to thousands of women every year. But most of them don't respond as strategically as you did. We'd like to feature your story as an example of how to protect yourself when you discover financial betrayal in a marriage." I agreed to participate in the documentary, though I insisted that Jessica's cooperation and eventual redemption be included in the story. It was important to me that the narrative not just focus on Marcus's misconduct, but also acknowledge that people can make better choices when confronted with evidence of wrongdoing. The documentary aired 18 months later and reached a surprisingly large audience, generating discussion about financial transparency in marriage and the importance of maintaining individual financial security even within committed relationships. I received hundreds of messages from viewers who'd recognized similar patterns in their own marriages and had been inspired to take action to protect themselves. 2 years after the divorce, Marcus attempted to contact me through LinkedIn, sending a professional message that ostensibly asked about business networking opportunities, but clearly represented an attempt to re-establish some kind of relationship. I deleted the message without responding and blocked his profile, having no interest in any form of contact with someone who demonstrated such a fundamental lack of integrity. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that Marcus had struggled to rebuild his career after leaving Phoenix. His termination from the pharmaceutical company had made it difficult to find comparable employment, and he'd eventually taken a sales position with a much smaller firm at significantly reduced compensation. He'd also been required to undergo financial counseling as part of our divorce settlement, though I had no information about whether the counseling had resulted in any genuine understanding of his misconduct. Jessica, by contrast, had successfully rebuilt her real estate career with a focus on first-time home buyers and modest residential properties. She'd also started a side business offering financial literacy workshops for women, drawing on her experience with financial dependency to help others avoid similar situations. 3 years after discovering Marcus's affair, I was invited to speak at a conference for divorced women about rebuilding after financial betrayal. The audience was filled with women at various stages of recovering from marriages that had involved deception, theft, or financial manipulation, and I was struck by how many common elements their stories shared. "The most important thing I learned," I told the audience, "is that you can't protect yourself from betrayal by trusting completely, but you can protect yourself by maintaining your own financial independence and staying alert to warning signs." Financial transparency isn't negotiable in a healthy marriage, and neither is honesty about major life decisions. I also emphasized the importance of taking action when you discover deception rather than hoping the situation will resolve itself. "Betrayal doesn't get better with time or patience," I said. "It gets worse until someone chooses to stop it. If your partner won't stop it, then you have to stop it yourself." The response to my presentation was overwhelming, with dozens of women approaching me afterward to share their own stories and ask for advice about protecting themselves in similar situations. Many of them were still married, but had discovered suspicious financial activity that their husbands couldn't adequately explain. Today, 5 years after serving Marcus with divorce papers, I run a successful marketing consultancy that employs 12 people and generates over $2 million in annual revenue. I own my home outright, have substantial investments in retirement and business accounts, and maintain complete control over my financial security. More importantly, I've learned to trust my instincts about people and situations in ways that I couldn't when I was younger and more willing to give others the benefit of the doubt. When I see warning signs of deception or manipulation, I investigate rather than hoping for the best. When someone's actions don't match their words, I believe their actions regardless of how convincing their explanations might be. I've also learned that taking action to protect yourself isn't about being vindictive or cruel. It's about refusing to accept betrayal as something you have to endure silently. Justice doesn't require hatred or revenge. It simply requires insisting that people face appropriate consequences for their choices. Marcus thought he could steal from our marriage to fund his affair because he assumed I would never discover his deception. Or that if I did discover it, I would choose to preserve our relationship rather than face the disruption of divorce. He underestimated both my intelligence and my willingness to fight for what was rightfully mine. That miscalculation cost him his marriage, his career, his financial security, and his reputation. But more than that, it cost him the opportunity to be married to someone who had genuinely loved him and worked to build a life together. I would have forgiven many things, but I couldn't forgive systematic theft and deliberate deception sustained over months of lies. The fortune Marcus thought he was stealing was never really ours to begin with. It was mine, built through my own work and protected by my own planning. When he emptied our joint accounts, he was taking money I'd already moved beyond his reach. When he lost access to what he thought was our shared wealth, he discovered that he'd never actually had access to the real foundation of our financial security. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply refusing to be a victim and insisting that the truth be acknowledged and justice be served. Sometimes it's building something so strong that no one else's betrayal can destroy what you've created for yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.